true pagan origin of the resurrection. Why Jesus isn't the first dying and rising God. The story I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about the origins of Christianity. It's a story that reaches back thousands of years before Jesus walked the earth, spanning ancient civilizations from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Greece to Rome. And at its heart lies a pattern so consistent, so widespread, that it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Was the resurrection of Jesus truly unique, or was it the culmination of a much older tradition? Today, we're diving deep into the archaeological and historical evidence that reveals the true pagan origins of dying and rising gods. We'll explore how these ancient deities shaped the religious landscape that Christianity emerged from, and why understanding this connection is crucial to grasping the real story of human spirituality. Because what you're about to discover isn't just academic theory, it's documented fact that religious institutions have spent centuries trying to downplay or ignore entirely. But before we go any further, let me be clear about something. This isn't an attack on faith or belief. This is about understanding history as it actually happened, not as we've been told it happened. And the historical record reveals something fascinating. The concept of a god who dies and rises again wasn't invented in 1st century Palestine. It was already ancient by the time Jesus was born. So buckle up, because we're about to journey through time to uncover the truth about resurrection mythology, and why the evidence suggests that Christianity didn't create this concept, but inherited it from much older traditions. The first thing you need to understand is that modern scholarship has been engaged in a massive cover-up operation for over a century. And I don't mean some conspiracy theory nonsense. I mean legitimate academic scholars have been systematically downplaying the connections between pre-Christian resurrection myths and the Jesus story. The most influential figure in this campaign was Jonathan Smith, whose work in the late 20th century convinced many that dying and rising gods were largely mythological constructs with no real basis in ancient religion. Smith's argument was simple, but devastating. He claimed that most of the gods identified as dying and rising actually only died and never truly rose again. According to his analysis, scholars like James Frazer, who first identified this pattern in his groundbreaking work, The Golden Bough, were engaging in wishful thinking, reading resurrection themes into myths where they didn't actually exist. But here's the problem with Smith's argument. It completely ignores a mountain of archaeological and textual evidence that proves these resurrection myths were not only real, but central to ancient religious practice. And the scholar who definitively demolished Smith's position was Tryggve Mettinger, whose exhaustive research proved that numerous pre-Christian gods did indeed die and rise again, often in elaborate ritual ceremonies that bear striking similarities to later Christian practices. Mettinger's work is crucial because it's based on primary sources, not speculation. He analyzed thousands of cuneiform tablets, hieroglyphic inscriptions, and Greek texts to reconstruct the actual beliefs and practices of ancient peoples. And what he found was undeniable. Dying and rising gods were known throughout the ancient Near East, long before Christianity appeared on the scene. Let's start with the oldest and most influential example: Osiris of Egypt. The Osiris myth is perhaps the most elaborate resurrection story in human history, and it predates Christianity by thousands of years. Archaeological evidence suggests that Osiris worship began as early as the pre-dynastic period, before 3100 BCE. That means this resurrection mythology was already over 3,000 years old when Jesus was born. The story itself reads like a template for later resurrection narratives. Osiris was a divine king who was murdered by his jealous brother Set. His body was dismembered and scattered across Egypt, but his devoted wife Isis gathered the pieces and through magical means restored him to life. Osiris then ascended to rule the underworld, becoming the judge of the dead and the promise of eternal life for faithful believers. But here's what makes this even more significant. The Osiris resurrection wasn't just a story people told around campfires. It was the centerpiece of elaborate religious festivals that drew millions of participants across Egypt for thousands of years. Every year, Egyptians would ritually reenact the death, burial, and resurrection of Osiris in ceremonies that lasted for days. They would create effigies of the god, bury them, and then celebrate their miraculous return to life. The parallels to later Christian practice are impossible to ignore. Osiris died for the salvation of humanity. He conquered death and promised eternal life to his followers. He was associated with bread and grain, symbols of life emerging from death. His resurrection was celebrated with joy and thanksgiving. Sound familiar? And this wasn't some obscure cult practiced in remote corners of Egypt. Osiris worship was the dominant religion of one of the world's great civilizations for over 3,000 years. By the time of the Roman Empire, Isis and Osiris temples could be found throughout the Mediterranean world, including in Palestine itself. But Osiris wasn't alone. Moving east into Mesopotamia, we encounter another ancient dying and rising god, Tammuz, also known as Dumuzi. The earliest mentions of Tammuz date to around 2600 BCE, making his cult nearly as old as that of Osiris. And like Osiris, Tammuz's story involves death, descent into the underworld, and eventual return to life. The Tammuz myth tells how this shepherd god was condemned to spend half the year in the underworld, a substitute for the goddess Inanna. But he doesn't stay dead. Instead, he alternates between death and life in an eternal cycle, spending 6 months below and 6 months above ground. His return each spring was celebrated as the victory of life over death, of fertility over barrenness. What makes Tammuz particularly significant for our story is that his worship spread throughout the ancient Near East, including into Palestine itself. The Hebrew Bible explicitly mentions Tammuz worship, describing how Jewish women in Jerusalem were mourning for Tammuz at the very temple of Yahweh. This isn't speculation or theory. It's documented historical fact that dying and rising god worship was present in the religious environment that produced Christianity. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Tammuz worship didn't stay in Mesopotamia. As trade routes expanded and cultures mixed, his story spread westward, evolving and adapting to new cultures. In Phoenicia, he became known as Adon, meaning Lord. And when Greek culture encountered this Phoenician deity, they transformed him into Adonis, the beautiful youth beloved by Aphrodite. The Adonis myth follows the same basic pattern we've seen before. A divinically desk figure dies tragens to the underworld and is restored to life through the intervention of a goddess. The Greeks celebrated Adonis festivals throughout their empire, ritual observances that featured mourning for the dead god, followed by celebration of his resurrection. But the Greek world also developed its own indigenous dying and rising god, Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is particularly important because his myth contains elements that will sound very familiar to anyone who knows the Jesus story. Dionysus was born of a divine father and mortal mother. He died and was resurrected. He was associated with wine and bread. He promised salvation to his followers. His mysteries involved ritual death and rebirth. The Dionysiac mysteries were among the most popular religious practices in the ancient world. Initiates would undergo ritual death and resurrection, symbolically dying with their god and rising again to new life. They believed this experience guaranteed them eternal life after death. These weren't metaphorical or symbolic deaths. Participants genuinely believed they were dying and being reborn through their connection to Dionysus. Moving north into Asia Minor, we encounter yet another dying and rising god, Attis, the consort of the great mother Cybele. The Attis myth tells how this young god castrated himself in a fit of madness and died beneath a pine tree. But he too was restored to life, and his resurrection became the focus of elaborate annual festivals. The Atis celebrations were particularly intense, featuring days of mourning followed by the joyful announcement that the god had risen. The similarity to later Christian Holy Week observances is striking. Believers would fast and mourn for 3 days, then celebrate the god's return to life with feasting and rejoicing. What we're seeing here isn't coincidence. It's a consistent pattern of religious belief and practice that spans thousands of years and multiple cultures. Across the ancient world, people worshipped gods who died and rose again. They celebrated these resurrections in elaborate festivals. They believed these divine deaths and resurrections offered them hope of eternal life. And all of this happened centuries or millennia before Christianity appeared. The religious landscape of the first century Mediterranean world was saturated with dying and rising god mythology. Anyone growing up in this environment would have been thoroughly familiar with these concepts. But there's something else we need to understand about these ancient resurrection myths. They weren't just stories. They were based on careful observation of the natural world. Ancient peoples noticed that vegetation died each winter and returned to life each spring. They saw that grain had to be buried in the ground before it could sprout and grow. The cycle of death and rebirth was all around them in nature, so they created gods who embodied this natural cycle. Osiris represented the flooding and receding of the Nile that brought life to Egypt. Tammuz embodied the death and renewal of vegetation. Adonis symbolized the eternal cycle of seasons. These weren't abstract theological concepts. They were religious interpretations of observable natural phenomena. And this brings us to a crucial point. The dying and rising god pattern wasn't unique to any single culture or time period. It was a universal human response to the mystery of death and the hope for renewal. Wherever agricultural societies developed, they tended to create similar mythologies about gods who died and rose again. The archaeological evidence for this is overwhelming. We have thousands of artifacts depicting these resurrection scenes. Temple complexes dedicated to dying and rising gods. Ritual objects used in resurrection ceremonies. Literary texts describing the myths in detail. This isn't speculation based on fragmentary evidence. It's documented historical fact. Yet somehow, many people today remain completely unaware of this rich tradition of pre-Christian resurrection mythology. Why? Because acknowledging it raises uncomfortable questions about the uniqueness of Christianity. If dying and rising gods were common throughout the ancient world, then what makes Jesus different? This is where we need to examine the evidence carefully and honestly. Because what we're about to discover will challenge some deeply held assumptions about the origins of Christianity and the development of human religious consciousness. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the ritual practices surrounding these ancient dying and rising gods. Because here's what the archaeological record reveals. These weren't just stories people believed. They were elaborate religious ceremonies that involved actual physical reenactments of death and resurrection, complete with sacred dramas, mystery initiations, and promises of eternal life. Take the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, centered around Demeter and Persephone. For over 1,000 years, pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world traveled to Eleusis to participate in secret rituals that promised initiates victory over death. The exact details of these ceremonies were so closely guarded that we still don't know everything that happened. But ancient sources make it clear that participants underwent a symbolic death and rebirth experience that transformed their understanding of mortality. Cicero himself, one of Rome's greatest orators, was an initiate. He wrote that the Eleusinian mysteries taught people not only how to live well, but how to die with hope. Plutarch described the initiation as a kind of death, where the soul was separated from the body, only to be reunited in a state of divine illumination. These weren't casual religious observances. They were life-changing spiritual experiences that people traveled hundreds of miles to undergo. And here's the kicker. The Eleusinian mysteries were still being practiced when Christianity emerged. The temple complex wasn't finally closed until the late 4th century CE, well after Christianity had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. This means that for the first 3 centuries of Christian history, dying and rising god mysteries were operating right alongside Christian communities. But let's dig deeper into the specific mechanics of these ancient resurrection beliefs, because when you examine the details, the parallels to Christianity become even more striking. Consider the cult of Mithras, which was enormously popular among Roman soldiers throughout the empire. Mithras was a solar deity who was said to have been born from a rock on December 25th. He performed miracles, had 12 disciples, and promised salvation to his followers through his sacrificial death. The Mithraic mysteries involved 7 levels of initiation, each representing a spiritual death and rebirth. Initiates would descend into underground temples called Mithraea, where they would undergo ritual ordeals designed to strip away their old identity and create a new one. They would emerge from these ceremonies, believing they had died with their god and risen again to eternal life. Sound familiar? The parallels to Christian baptism are unmistakable. Both involve symbolic death and rebirth. Both promise salvation through identification with a dying and rising deity. Both create a new spiritual identity for the believer. The main difference is that Mithraic initiation was a gradual process involving multiple stages, while Christian baptism compressed the entire experience into a single ceremony. Now, defenders of Christian uniqueness might argue that these are just surface similarities, that the underlying theology is completely different. But when you examine the actual beliefs and practices, the distinctions become much harder to maintain. Because these ancient mystery religions weren't just about personal transformation, they were about cosmic salvation. Take Osiris worship, for example. Egyptians didn't just believe that Osiris had conquered death for himself. They believed his resurrection had fundamentally altered the nature of reality, opening up the possibility of eternal life for all humanity. His victory over death was cosmic in scope, affecting not just individual believers, but the entire universe. The ritual texts are explicit about this. They describe how Osiris's resurrection restored the cosmic order, bringing light out of darkness, life out of death, order out of chaos. His death was understood as a sacrifice that benefited all of creation. His resurrection was the guarantee that death itself had been defeated. This isn't just similar to Christian theology. In many cases, it's virtually identical. The idea that a god's death and resurrection could have universal salvific significance wasn't invented by Christianity. It was already ancient when the first Christians began formulating their beliefs about Jesus. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because we can actually trace how these older resurrection mythologies influenced early Christian thinking. The process wasn't mysterious or hidden. It happened through direct cultural contact and religious syncretism. Consider the city of Alexandria in Egypt, one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. This was where Jewish and Greek cultures had been mixing for centuries before Christianity arrived. It was home to the largest Jewish community outside Palestine, but it was also a major center of Egyptian religion, Greek philosophy, and mystery cult worship. When Christian missionaries reached Alexandria, they encountered a religious environment already saturated with dying and rising god mythology. Local Jews had been living alongside Osiris worshippers for generations. Greek-speaking intellectuals were familiar with Platonic ideas about the soul's immortality. Mystery cult initiates were celebrating ritual deaths and resurrections on a regular basis. The early Christian community in Alexandria didn't develop in isolation from these influences. They absorbed them, adapted them, and integrated them into their own understanding of Jesus. This process is clearly visible in the writings of early Christian theologians like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who explicitly drew connections between Christian beliefs and older religious traditions. Clement actually argued that Greek philosophy and mystery religions were a kind of preparation for Christianity, that God had used these earlier traditions to prepare humanity for the gospel message. Origen went even further, suggesting that the similarities between Christian and pagan beliefs proved that truth was universal, that the same divine reality was being expressed through different cultural forms. This wasn't considered controversial at the time. Early Christians understood that they were part of a larger religious conversation that had been going on for centuries. They saw themselves as the culmination of humanity's search for divine truth, not as something completely unprecedented. The problem is that later Christian theologians became uncomfortable with these connections. As Christianity gained political power and cultural dominance, church leaders began emphasizing the uniqueness of their faith over its continuity with older traditions. The similarities to pagan religions that early Christians had celebrated became embarrassments to be explained away. This process reached its climax in the 4th and 5th centuries, when Christian emperors began systematically suppressing pagan religions. Temples were closed, statues were destroyed, and practitioners were persecuted. The rich tradition of dying and rising god worship that had flourished for thousands of years was deliberately erased from public memory. But the archaeological record doesn't lie. The artifacts are still there, buried in museums and archaeological sites around the world. The texts survive, even if they're rarely religious education. The evidence discussed in Popular is overwhelming that Christianity emerged from a religious environment already rich with resurrection mythology. And this evidence keeps growing. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new examples of pre-Christian dying and rising god worship. In recent decades, scholars have uncovered temples, ritual objects, and inscriptions that demonstrate just how widespread these beliefs were in the ancient world. Take the discoveries at Dura Europos, an ancient city on the Euphrates River that was abandoned in the 3rd century CE. Archaeologists have found evidence of at least 15 different religious traditions operating side by side in this single city. There were temples to Mesopotamian gods, Syrian deities, Greek and Roman divinities, and yes, a Christian church. All of these communities were living and worshipping together, sharing ideas and influencing each other's beliefs. The Christian frescoes found at Dura Europos show clear influence from surrounding religious traditions. The artistic styles, symbolic imagery, and even some of the theological concepts reflect the multicultural environment in which early Christianity developed. This wasn't a pure, isolated faith developing in a vacuum. It was part of a complex religious ecosystem. Similar discoveries have been made throughout the former Roman Empire. Everywhere archaeologists dig, they find evidence of religious syncretism, of different traditions borrowing from and influencing each other. The idea that any religion could develop in complete isolation from its cultural environment is simply not supported by the evidence. So where does this leave us? What are we to make of the overwhelming evidence that dying and rising god mythology predates Christianity by thousands of years? How do we understand the relationship between these older traditions and the Christian story of Jesus' resurrection? The answer isn't simple, because it challenges some fundamental assumptions about religious history and the nature of divine revelation. But the evidence is too strong to ignore. Christianity didn't emerge in a religious vacuum. It developed within a cultural context already rich with resurrection mythology, and it absorbed and adapted many of the themes, symbols, and practices of older traditions. This doesn't necessarily invalidate Christian faith, but it does require us to think more carefully about what makes religious claims true or meaningful. If the resurrection narrative was already ancient when Christianity adopted it, then the uniqueness of Christianity must lie somewhere other than in the originality of its central myth. Perhaps what matters isn't whether the story is unprecedented, but whether it's true. perhaps the widespread nature of dying and rising god mythology across different cultures and time periods, suggests something fundamental about human nature and our relationship with the divine. Perhaps these ancient patterns reflect deep truths about the nature of existence that transcend any particular religious tradition. But to explore these questions honestly, we need to first acknowledge what the evidence actually shows us. And what it shows is that the dying and rising god pattern wasn't invented by Christianity. It was inherited from much older sources, adapted to new circumstances, and given new meaning within a different cultural context. The implications of this recognition extend far beyond academic history. They debates about religious touch on fundamental questions about truth, tradition, and the nature of spiritual experience itself. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire phenomenon: the deliberate suppression of evidence by early Christian authorities. Because what we're dealing with here isn't just natural historical evolution. It's active erasure, systematic destruction of records, and calculated rewriting of history. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, something unprecedented happened. For the first time in human history, a religious movement gained the political power to literally rewrite the past. And that's exactly what they did. Christian emperors didn't just suppress pagan religions. They ordered the destruction of libraries, the melting down of statues, and the systematic elimination of any evidence that might challenge Christian claims to uniqueness. The most devastating example was the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria. This wasn't some accidental fire or natural disaster. It was a deliberate campaign to erase thousands of years of accumulated religious and philosophical knowledge. Scrolls containing detailed accounts of mystery religions, philosophical treatises on the nature of resurrection, and historical records of dying and rising god worship were systematically burned or allowed to rot. But here's what the Christian authorities couldn't destroy: the archaeological record. You can burn books and melt down statues, but you can't erase every temple foundation, every ritual object, every inscription carved in stone. And that's why modern archaeology has been so devastating to traditional Christian claims about the uniqueness of the resurrection narrative. Every shovel full of dirt reveals more evidence of pre-Christian resurrection beliefs. Every newly translated tablet provides more details about ancient dying and rising god worship. The evidence just keeps mounting, and it paints a picture that's radically different from what most people have been taught about Christian origins. Take the recent discoveries in Syria, where archaeologists have uncovered a massive temple complex dedicated to Baal, the Canaanite storm god who dies and rises with the seasons. The site includes detailed relief carvings depicting Baal's death, descent into the underworld, and triumphant resurrection. These carvings date to the 2nd millennium BCE, over 1,000 years before the earliest Christian writings. But what makes this discovery particularly significant is its location. This temple sits just 50, one of the earliest miles from Damascus centers of Christian missionary activity. The Apostle Paul himself would have traveled past this site on his journeys through Syria. The early Christian communities in this region were literally surrounded by monuments to dying and rising gods. You can't understand the development of early Christianity without recognizing this religious environment. Christian missionaries weren't preaching to people who had never heard of resurrection mythology. They were addressing audiences already familiar with these concepts, people who had been celebrating divine deaths and resurrections for centuries. And this familiarity shows up in the earliest Christian writings. When Paul writes to the Corinthians about Christ's resurrection, he uses language and imagery that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with mystery religion terminology. His description of believers dying and rising with Christ mirrors the initiation experiences of countless mystery cult participants. The Gospel writers do the same thing. Mark's account of Jesus emerging from the tomb after 3 days follows the exact same pattern as countless earlier resurrection narratives. Matthew's description of the earthquake and the rolling away of the stone echoes similar miraculous events in Osiris and Dionysus stories. Luke's account of Jesus appearing to his disciples in a transformed body parallels the resurrection appearances of numerous pagan gods. This isn't coincidence. It's conscious adaptation of familiar religious themes to tell the story of Jesus. The gospel writers were crafting their narratives for audiences who would immediately recognize these patterns and understand their significance. But the influence goes deeper than just narrative structure. The entire theological framework of Christianity shows clear signs of borrowing from older resurrection traditions. The concept of salvation through identification with a dying and rising God wasn't invented by Christian theologians. It was already the central teaching of dozens of mystery religions throughout the ancient world. Consider the doctrine of substitutionary atonement, the idea that Christ's death somehow pays the penalty for human sin. This concept makes no sense within a purely Jewish religious framework, where sin offerings were always performed by the priests, not by God himself. But it makes perfect sense within the context of dying and rising God mythology, where divine sacrifice was understood to restore cosmic balance and offer salvation to worshippers. The early Christians didn't develop this theology in isolation. They inherited it from the religious environment they grew up in, an environment saturated with beliefs about gods who died for the sake of their followers and rose again to offer them eternal life. And the evidence for this inheritance is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Christian art from the first few centuries is filled with symbols and imagery borrowed directly from pagan resurrection cults. The Chi-Rho symbol, supposedly representing Christ, is virtually identical to symbols used in Mithraic worship. The fish symbol associated with early Christianity was also sacred to dying and rising gods like Attis and Adonis. Even Christian architecture shows these influences. The basilica design used for early churches was borrowed directly from Roman religious buildings. The orientation toward the east, the placement of the altar, the use of crypts and underground chambers, all of these elements were standard features of mystery religion temples, long before they appeared in Christian contexts. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the Christian calendar itself. The major Christian holidays align almost perfectly with pre-existing pagan festivals celebrating the deaths and resurrections of ancient gods. Christmas falls on the winter solstice, when numerous solar deities were said to be reborn. Easter coincides with spring fertility festivals honoring rising vegetation gods. This isn't accidental. Early Christian leaders deliberately scheduled their celebrations to coincide with existing religious observances. They understood that people were already accustomed to celebrating divine deaths and resurrections at certain times of the year, and they simply adapted these existing practices to Christian purposes. The process is documented in early church writings. Pope Gregory the Great explicitly instructed missionaries to adapt pagan temples and festivals rather than trying to eliminate them entirely. He understood that religious conversion was more effective when it built on existing beliefs rather than trying to replace them completely. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because while Christian authorities were busy adapting pagan resurrection mythology to their own purposes, they were simultaneously denying that any such borrowing had taken place. They claimed that Christianity was completely unique, that the resurrection of Jesus was unprecedented in human history. This created a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Christian theology. On one hand, Christian practices and beliefs showed clear evidence of borrowing from older traditions. On the other hand, Christian doctrine insisted on the absolute uniqueness of the Christian message. This tension has persisted for 2,000 years, and it explains much of the defensive reaction we see when scholars point out the similarities between Christianity and earlier religions. The cognitive dissonance is understandable. If you've been taught that your religion is uniquely true because it contains unprecedented revelations, then discovering that similar revelations appeared in earlier traditions creates a serious crisis of faith. Either your religion isn't unique, or the earlier traditions must somehow be explained away. Christian apologists have tried various strategies to resolve this dilemma. Some argue that the similarities are purely superficial, that deeper examination reveals fundamental differences between Christian and pagan beliefs. Others claim that Satan deliberately created false versions of Christian truths in advance, in order to confuse people when the real truth finally appeared. But these explanations become increasingly difficult to maintain as our knowledge of ancient religions expands. The similarities aren't superficial. They extend to the deepest levels of belief and practice. And the chronological evidence is clear. The pagan versions came first, often by thousands of years. A more honest approach is to recognize that religious truth isn't dependent on historical uniqueness. Many of humanity's deepest insights about the nature of existence have appeared independently in multiple cultures and time periods. The fact that resurrection mythology is widespread doesn't necessarily invalidate any particular version of it. It might actually suggest that these themes reflect something fundamental about human experience and our relationship with the divine. But this recognition requires abandoning claims about the absolute uniqueness of any single religious tradition. It means acknowledging that Christianity emerged from and participated in a much larger conversation about death, resurrection, and salvation that had been going on for millennia before Jesus was born. This shift in perspective has profound implications. It suggests that instead of viewing different religions as competing truth claims, we might see them as different expressions of universal human insights about the nature of existence. The dying and rising God pattern appears across cultures not because of historical borrowing, but because it reflects something true about the human condition. Think about it from a purely psychological perspective. Every human being faces the reality of death. We all struggle with questions about what happens after we die, whether consciousness survives physical dissolution, and how we should live in the face of mortality. The dying and rising God mythology provides a framework for addressing these universal concerns. When ancient peoples created stories about gods who died and rose again, they were expressing their deepest hopes and fears about their own mortality. These myths offered comfort in the face of death, hope for continuation beyond the grave, and meaning in the midst of life's struggles. They served profound psychological and spiritual needs that are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. From this perspective, the widespread appearance of resurrection mythology isn't surprising. It's inevitable. Any species capable of contemplating its own mortality would naturally develop beliefs and practices designed to cope with that awareness. The specific details might vary from culture to culture, but the underlying themes would be remarkably consistent. And that's exactly what we see in the archaeological record. Cultures that had no contact with each other developed similar beliefs about dying and rising gods. The details differ, but the core pattern remains constant. A divine figure dies, descends to the underworld, and returns to life, offering hope and salvation to followers. This universality suggests that we're dealing with something much deeper than historical borrowing or cultural influence. We're looking at a fundamental human response to the mystery of existence, expressed through religious symbolism and ritual practice. But recognizing this universality doesn't diminish the significance of any particular religious tradition. Instead, it places individual religions within a larger context of human spiritual development. Christianity becomes not the unique recipient of divine revelation, but one powerful expression of humanity's ongoing search for meaning and transcendence. This perspective opens up new possibilities for interfaith dialogue and mutual understanding. Instead of arguing about which religion has the exclusive truth, we can explore how different traditions contribute to our collective understanding of spiritual reality. We can appreciate the unique insights of each tradition while recognizing their common participation in universal human concerns. The evidence we've examined today points toward this more inclusive understanding. The dying and rising God pattern wasn't invented by any single culture or religion. It emerged independently in multiple contexts because it addresses fundamental questions about human existence that transcend cultural boundaries. Christianity's contribution to this tradition isn't its uniqueness, but its particular way of expressing and developing these ancient themes. The Christian story of Jesus' death and resurrection gains its power not from being unprecedented, but from being a particularly compelling version of humanity's oldest and most persistent religious insight, that death is not the end, that life can emerge from death, and that divine love is stronger than any force that seeks to destroy it. This understanding doesn't require us to abandon religious faith or reduce all traditions to mere mythology. Instead, it invites us to see our individual religious commitments within the context of humanity's broader spiritual journey. It suggests that the truths we find in our own traditions might also be present, in different forms, in the traditions of others. The archaeological evidence will continue to accumulate. New discoveries will further illuminate the rich tradition of pre-Christian resurrection mythology. Our understanding of how these ancient beliefs influence the development of Christianity will become increasingly detailed and nuanced. But the fundamental pattern is already clear. The concept of a dying and rising God wasn't invented in first century Palestine. It was already ancient when Christianity emerged, already developed into sophisticated theological and ritual systems that had sustained human communities for thousands of years. Recognition of this fact doesn't diminish Christianity's significance. It places it within its proper historical context as one expression of humanity's deepest spiritual insights. And it opens up new possibilities for understanding how religious truth operates across cultures and throughout history. The story of dying and rising gods is ultimately the story of humanity's refusal to accept death as the final word. It's the story of hope persisting in the face of despair, of life asserting itself against all odds, of love proving stronger than hatred or fear. These themes appear again and again throughout human history because they reflect something essential about who we are as conscious beings confronting our own mortality. Understanding the true origins of resurrection mythology doesn't destroy faith. It reveals faith's deepest sources in the universal human experience of loss, hope, and renewal. And it suggests that the power of these ancient stories lies not in their historical uniqueness, but in their continued ability to speak to the deepest needs of the human heart. The implications of this recognition extend far beyond academic debates about religious history. They touch on fundamental questions about how truth itself functions in human consciousness. Because here's what the evidence suggests. The power of religious narratives doesn't come from their historical originality, but from their psychological resonance with universal human experiences. When we examine the dying and rising God pattern across different cultures, we're not just looking at random mythological coincidences. We're observing the consistent emergence of a specific psychological archetype that addresses core human anxieties about death, meaning, and continuity. This pattern appears so frequently because it provides a framework for processing experiences that every human being must confront. Consider what happens in the human psyche when we become aware of our own mortality. This awareness creates what psychologists call existential anxiety, a deep psychological tension that demands resolution. The dying and rising God mythology provides that resolution by transforming death from an ending into a transformation, from a termination into a transition. But the psychological function of these myths goes even deeper. They don't just address individual fears about death. They provide entire communities with a shared framework for understanding the cycles of loss and renewal that characterize all human experience. Relationships end and begin. Societies rise and fall. Economic systems collapse and rebuild. The dying and rising God pattern gives people a way to understand these cycles as meaningful rather than random. This is why agricultural societies were particularly drawn to these mythologies. Farmers watching their crops die each winter and return each spring had a direct, visceral understanding of death and resurrection as natural processes. The dying and rising God stories gave religious meaning to what they observed in their daily lives. But urban civilizations developed these themes just as enthusiastically, because city dwellers faced their own cycles of destruction and renewal. Political upheavals, economic collapses, military conquests, all of these urban experiences could be understood through the lens of death and resurrection mythology. The gods who died and rose again provide that communities' hope too could survive catastrophe and emerge transformed. The mystery religions took these agricultural and social metaphors and turned them into personal spiritual experiences. Instead of just observing the cycles of death and renewal in nature and society, individuals could participate directly in the divine pattern through ritual initiation. They could die symbolically with their god and rise again to a new form of existence. This is where the evidence becomes particularly striking, because the mystery religion initiations weren't just symbolic gestures. They were profound psychological experiences that participants described as literally life-changing. Ancient sources make it clear that people who underwent these rituals emerged with fundamentally altered consciousness, convinced that they had transcended ordinary human limitations. The initiation into the Dionysiac mysteries involved participants consuming mind-altering substances while reenacting the god's death and resurrection. They would experience states of consciousness that seemed to confirm the reality of life beyond death. The psychological impact was so powerful that initiates often dedicated their entire lives to serving the god who had revealed these truths to them. Similar reports come from other mystery traditions. The Mithric initiations involve sensory deprivation, extreme physical ordeals, and ritual death experiences that convince participants they had accessed divine reality. The Eleusinian mysteries used carefully orchestrated theatrical presentations combined with sacred substances to create overwhelming spiritual experiences that initiates remembered for the rest of their lives. These weren't primitive superstitions or crude psychological manipulation. They were sophisticated technologies of consciousness that used ritual, symbol, and altered states to produce genuine spiritual transformation. The fact that they were based on dying and rising god mythology doesn't diminish their effectiveness. It explains why this particular religious pattern was so persistent and powerful. When Christianity emerged into this environment, it had several advantages over existing mystery religions. First, it offered the dying and rising god experience without requiring expensive initiations or lengthy preparation. Baptism could be performed immediately, making the transformative power of resurrection mythology accessible to anyone. Second, Christianity democratized the mystery tradition by removing the secrecy and exclusivity that characterized other resurrection cults. The Christian message was proclaimed publicly, written down in accessible texts, and shared freely with anyone willing to listen. This openness allowed Christian resurrection beliefs to spread much more rapidly than traditional mystery religions. Third, Christianity connected the dying and rising god pattern to a historical figure rather than a purely mythological deity. Whether or not the gospel accounts are historically accurate, they presented Jesus as a real person who had lived in recent memory, not as an ancient god from primordial times. This gave Christian resurrection beliefs an immediacy and relevance that older mythologies sometimes lacked. But perhaps most importantly, Christianity emerged at a time when the Roman Empire was experiencing unprecedented cultural mixing. Trade routes connected distant regions, military campaigns brought different peoples into contact, and urban centers became melting pots of diverse religious traditions. This created ideal conditions for religious syncretism, allowing Christian missionaries to draw from multiple resurrection traditions simultaneously. The result was a version of dying and rising god mythology that was both familiar and innovative. Christian resurrection beliefs incorporated elements from Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Persian, and Jewish traditions, creating a synthesis that appealed to people from all of these backgrounds. The Christian story felt both recognizable and fresh, traditional and revolutionary. This synthetic quality is visible throughout early Christian literature. The Gospel of John opens with language borrowed directly from Greek philosophical traditions about the divine logos. Paul's letters use terminology from mystery religions to describe Christian initiation experiences. The Book of Revelation draws imagery from Persian, Jewish, and Greco-Roman apocalyptic traditions. Early Christian art shows the same synthetic character. Catacomb paintings depict Christ using artistic conventions developed for representing Orpheus, Dionysus, and other dying and rising gods. Christian sarcophagi incorporate symbols and motifs from Egyptian funerary art. Church architecture borrows design elements from mystery religion temples. This wasn't accidental or unconscious borrowing. Early Christian leaders were deliberately crafting a religious message that would resonate with people already familiar with dying and rising god traditions. They understood that successful religious movements don't emerge in cultural vacuums. They build on existing beliefs and practices, adapting them to new circumstances and giving them fresh meaning. The evidence for this conscious adaptation is everywhere in early Christian sources. Church fathers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian explicitly acknowledge the similarities between Christian beliefs and pagan religions. Instead of denying these connections, they used them as evangelistic tools, arguing that pagan religions had prepared people to understand Christian truth. This approach worked remarkably well for the first few centuries of Christian history. Christian communities grew rapidly throughout the Roman Empire, often by attracting converts who were already participating in mystery religions. These converts didn't have to abandon their basic religious worldview. They just had to transfer their dying and rising God devotion from traditional deities to Jesus Christ. But this success created problems for later Christian theology. As Christianity became more institutionally powerful, church leaders began emphasizing doctrinal purity over evangelistic effectiveness. The similarities to pagan religions that had once been selling points became embarrassing reminders of Christianity's composite origins. The shift is clearly visible in the writings of 4th and 5th century church fathers. Earlier Christian leaders had celebrated the connections between Christian and pagan beliefs. Later theologians began denying these connections, insisting that any similarities were either coincidental or demonic deceptions designed to confuse the faithful. This defensive posture became more pronounced as Christianity gained political power. Christian emperors didn't just suppress pagan religions. They ordered the destruction of historical records that might document Christianity's debt to earlier traditions. Libraries were burned, inscriptions were defaced, and scholars who studied comparative religion were persecuted. The systematic destruction of evidence was so thorough that for over 1,000 years, most Christians remained unaware of the rich tradition of pre-Christian resurrection mythology. The dying and rising God pattern that had once been common knowledge became a closely guarded academic secret, known only to specialists in ancient history and archaeology. This historical amnesia allowed later Christian theology to develop claims about absolute uniqueness that earlier Christians would have found absurd. Medieval theologians could argue that Christianity was unprecedented because they had access to so little information about pre-Christian religions. The evidence had been deliberately destroyed or hidden away in monastery libraries. The rediscovery of this suppressed history began during the Renaissance, when European scholars gained access to newly translated ancient texts. But it accelerated dramatically during the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeological excavations began revealing the full extent of ancient dying and rising god worship. Each new discovery made the connections between Christianity and earlier religions more obvious. The parallels weren't just superficial similarities in narrative structure. They extended to theological concepts, ritual practices, artistic representations, and institutional organization. The evidence was overwhelming that Christianity had emerged from and participated in a much older tradition of resurrection-centered religion. Modern Christian apologetics has struggled to deal with this evidence. Some scholars continue to deny the connections, arguing that the similarities are either exaggerated or explainable through other means. Others acknowledge the parallels, but insist that Christianity transformed these older themes in unique ways that justify continued claims to religious distinctiveness. But these defensive strategies become increasingly difficult to maintain as our knowledge of ancient religions expands. The similarities between Christianity and pre-Christian resurrection traditions are too numerous, too detailed, and too well documented to dismiss as coincidence or misinterpretation. A more honest approach requires acknowledging that Christianity developed within a religious environment already rich with dying and rising god mythology. This doesn't necessarily invalidate Christian truth claims, but it does require rethinking what those claims actually mean. If the resurrection narrative wasn't unprecedented when Christianity adopted it, then Christianity's significance must lie somewhere other than in the originality of its central story. Perhaps what matters isn't whether the story is unique, but whether it's true. Perhaps the widespread appearance of dying and rising god mythology suggests that these themes reflect deep insights about the nature of existence that transcend any particular cultural expression. This shift in perspective opens up new possibilities for understanding religious truth itself. Instead of viewing truth as something possessed exclusively by one tradition, we might see it as something that emerges through the collective human search for meaning across cultures and throughout history. The dying and rising god pattern appears so frequently, not because later cultures borrowed from earlier ones, but because it addresses fundamental questions about human existence that every culture must confront. The specific details vary, but the underlying insights remain consistent. Death is not the final word. Consciousness can survive physical dissolution, and love is stronger than the forces that seek to destroy life. From this perspective, Christianity's contribution isn't its uniqueness, but its particular way of expressing and developing these universal insights. The Christian story gains its power not from being unprecedented, but from being a compelling and accessible version of humanity's oldest spiritual wisdom. This understanding doesn't require abandoning religious commitment or reducing all traditions to mere psychology. It invites us to see our individual faith within the context of humanity's broader spiritual journey. It suggests that the truths we find in our own traditions might also be present, in different forms, in the traditions of others. The archaeological evidence will continue to accumulate. New discoveries will further illuminate the connections between Christianity and earlier resurrection traditions. Our understanding of how religious ideas develop and spread will become increasingly sophisticated, but the fundamental insight is already clear. The dying and rising god pattern represents one of humanity's most persistent and powerful attempts to understand the mystery of existence. Christianity participated in this tradition rather than creating it, adapted it rather than inventing it, and succeeded by making it accessible to ordinary people in ways that earlier mystery religions had not. Recognizing this history doesn't diminish Christianity's spiritual significance. It reveals the deep sources of its psychological and social power in universal human experiences of loss, hope, and renewal. And it suggests that religious truth operates not through exclusive revelation, but through the collective human struggle to comprehend the deepest mysteries of consciousness and existence. The story of dying and rising gods is ultimately the story of humanity's refusal to accept limitations as final. It expresses our deepest conviction that consciousness is more than mere brain activity, that love transcends individual mortality, and that meaning persists even in the face of apparent meaninglessness. These insights appear again and again throughout human history, because they reflect something essential about the nature of conscious existence itself. They represent not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated attempts to understand the fundamental structure of reality from the perspective of beings who are simultaneously finite and infinite, mortal and eternal, individual and universal. Understanding the true origins of resurrection mythology doesn't destroy these insights. It reveals their deepest foundations in the universal human experience of being conscious in an apparently unconscious universe, and it points toward possibilities for religious understanding that transcend the limitations of any single cultural expression while honoring the profound truths that each tradition has discovered and preserved. The evidence I've presented today represents just the tip of the iceberg. What we're looking at isn't some fringe theory cooked up by anti-Christian scholars with an agenda. This is mainstream archaeology, documented history, primary source material that's been sitting in museums and academic journals for decades. The problem is that most people simply aren't aware it exists. And there's a reason for that ignorance. Because acknowledging this evidence fundamentally changes how we understand not just Christianity, but the entire development of human religious consciousness. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of religious truth, the role of cultural transmission in spiritual development, and the relationship between historical accuracy and meaningful belief. Let me give you a concrete example of how this suppression works in practice. In most universities today, students can take courses on ancient history, comparative mythology, even religious studies, but try to find a class that systematically examines the connections between pre-Christian dying and rising gods and the development of Christianity. They don't exist. The material is compartmentalized, scattered across different departments, taught by specialists who rarely communicate with each other. A student might learn about Osiris in an Egyptology class, study Dionysus in a course on Greek religion, and explore early Christianity in a New Testament survey. But nobody puts the pieces together. Nobody shows them the timeline. Nobody explains how these traditions influenced each other over thousands of years of cultural contact and religious evolution. This compartmentalization isn't accidental. Academic institutions, many of which were founded by religious organizations and still maintain ties to faith communities, have a vested interest in keeping this material separated. Donors don't want to fund research that challenges traditional religious narratives. Students from religious backgrounds might bade by evidence be distant that they're unique, as they'vent as faith traditions aren't being taught. So the evidence gets buried in specialized journals, locked away in graduate seminars, discussed only among scholars who already know not to rock the boat too violently. The general public remains ignorant. Religious believers continue to assume their traditions are unprecedented, and the cycle of historical amnesia perpetuates itself. But here's what's changing that dynamic. The internet has democratized access to information in ways that traditional gatekeepers can't control. Ancient texts that were once available only to specialists are now digitized and searchable online. Archaeological reports that used to languish in obscure journals are being shared on academic websites. Video lectures by world-class scholars are freely available to anyone with an internet connection. This democratization of knowledge is having profound effects. Young people especially are discovering the connections between Christianity and earlier religions, often to the shock and dismay of their religious educators. Traditional apologetic arguments that worked when people had limited access to comparative information are crumbling under the weight of easily accessible evidence. The response from religious institutions has been predictable. Some are doubling down on claims of uniqueness, insisting that any similarities to pagan religions are either superficial or demonic deceptions. Others are adapting by emphasizing the spiritual rather than historical significance of their traditions. Still others are embracing a more inclusive theology that sees truth as emerging through multiple cultural expressions. But individual believers are often caught in the middle, struggling to reconcile what they're discovering about religious history with what they've been taught about their faith. The cognitive dissonance can be intense, especially for people whose entire worldview has been built around assumptions of religious uniqueness and divine revelation. This is where the psychological dimension becomes crucial. Because what we're dealing with here isn't just historical information. It's an existential crisis that strikes at the heart of how people understand themselves, their purpose, and their relationship to ultimate reality. When someone discovers that their religion's central narrative has ancient parallels, it can feel like the foundation of their identity is crumbling. The natural response is often denial, anger, or desperate attempts to explain away the evidence. I've seen people spend years developing elaborate theories about why the similarities don't really matter, why Christianity is still unique, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The psychological investment in maintaining existing beliefs is enormous, and people will go to great lengths to protect that investment. But I've also seen something else. I've witnessed individuals who embrace this historical knowledge and use it to deepen rather than abandon their spiritual understanding. They recognize that truth doesn't require uniqueness, that wisdom can appear in multiple forms, that the power of religious narratives lies in there to illuminate universal human experiences rather than their historical originality. These people often develop a more mature and flexible approach to faith, one that's grounded in personal experience rather than institutional authority. They're able to appreciate the insights of their own tradition while remaining open to wisdom from other sources. They understand that religious truth operates through symbols, metaphors, and archetypal patterns that transcend the limitations of any particular cultural expression. This shift in perspective has profound implications for how we approach interfaith dialogue, religious education, and spiritual development. Instead of defending the walls between different traditions, we can explore the common ground that underlies them all. Instead of arguing about which religion has the exclusive truth, we can investigate how different approaches to spiritual understanding complement and enrich each other. The dying and rising God pattern offers a perfect example of this kind of universal insight. Every culture that has developed this mythology has been responding to the same fundamental human experiences: the reality of death, the hope for continuation, the search for meaning in the face of apparent meaninglessness. The specific stories vary, but the underlying concerns remain constant across time and geography. This suggests that we're dealing with something much deeper than historical borrowing or cultural influence. We're looking at the natural emergence of certain archetypal patterns that reflect the structure of human consciousness itself. These patterns appear repeatedly not because later cultures copied from earlier ones, but because they represent fundamental ways that conscious beings attempt to understand their relationship to existence. From this perspective, the widespread appearance of resurrection mythology becomes evidence for rather than against the significance of these themes. If only one culture had developed beliefs about dying and rising gods, we might dismiss them as random superstitions. But when the same patterns appear independently across multiple civilizations, it suggests that we're dealing with insights that reflect something true about the nature of reality itself. This doesn't mean that all religious claims are equally valid, or that historical accuracy doesn't matter. It means that we need more sophisticated ways of evaluating religious truth than simple appeals to uniqueness or historical precedents. We need to ask not just whether something happened, but what it means. Not just whether a story is original, but whether it illuminates aspects of human experience that remain relevant and meaningful. The Christian resurrection narrative gains its power not from being unprecedented, but from being a particularly compelling and accessible expression of themes that have resonated with human beings throughout history. The story works because it addresses universal concerns about death, meaning, and transcendence in ways that speak to fundamental aspects of human psychology and spiritual longing. But recognizing this doesn't require abandoning the story or reducing it to mere mythology. It means understanding the story's significance within the broader context of human religious development. It means appreciating how Christianity both participated in and transformed the ancient tradition of resurrection-centered spirituality. This transformation was real and significant. Christianity made the dying and rising God experience accessible to ordinary people in ways that earlier mystery religions had not. It democratized spiritual transformation by removing barriers of class, education, and cultural background. It connected resurrection themes to ethical teachings about love, compassion, and social justice in ways that gave them practical relevance beyond personal salvation. These innovations explain Christianity's historical success better than claims about unprecedented revelation. Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire not because it was completely unlike existing religions, but because it offered familiar spiritual benefits in more accessible and socially engaged forms. People converted not because they were encountering entirely new ideas, but because they were finding better expressions of insights they already valued. Understanding this history doesn't diminish Christianity's achievements. It explains them. It shows how successful religious movements work by building on existing spiritual foundations while adapting them to new circumstances and needs. It demonstrates that religious innovation happens through synthesis and transformation, rather than creation from nothing. The same principles apply to other religious traditions as well. Buddhism emerged from and transformed existing Hindu and Jain teachings about suffering, liberation, and spiritual development. Islam built upon Jewish and Christian monotheistic foundations, while adapting them to Arabian cultural contexts. Every major religious tradition shows evidence of borrowing, adaptation, and creative synthesis with earlier spiritual insights. This pattern of religious development through cultural interaction and creative adaptation is what we should expect from genuine spiritual traditions. Authentic insights about the nature of reality don't emerge in isolation. They develop through the collective human search for understanding, with each generation building upon the discoveries of previous ones while adapting them to contemporary needs and circumstances. The dying and rising God tradition represents one of humanity's most persistent and successful attempts to address fundamental questions about consciousness, mortality, and meaning. The tradition has survived for thousands of years, not because it was revealed once to a single culture, but because it continues to illuminate aspects of human experience that transcend cultural boundaries and historical periods. Christianity's participation in this tradition doesn't invalidate its spiritual significance. It reveals the deep sources of its psychological and social power in universal human experiences that every conscious being must confront. The Christian story resonates not because it's unique, but because it expresses eternal truths about the nature of existence in forms that remain accessible and meaningful to contemporary audiences. This understanding opens up new possibilities for religious dialogue and spiritual development. Instead of defending exclusive truth claims, different traditions can explore their common participation in humanity's ongoing search for wisdom and transcendence. Instead of competing for religious market share, they can collaborate in addressing the spiritual challenges that face all human beings, regardless of their cultural background. The archaeological evidence will continue to accumulate, providing ever more detailed pictures of how religious ideas have developed and spread throughout human history. Our understanding of consciousness, psychology, and spiritual experience will become increasingly sophisticated, offering new insights into why certain religious patterns appear so consistently across different cultures and time periods. But the fundamental recognition is already clear. Religious truth operates through universal human experiences, rather than exclusive cultural revelations. The dying and rising God pattern appears throughout history because it addresses concerns that every conscious being must face. Its power lies not in its historical uniqueness, but in its continued relevance to the deepest questions of human existence. This recognition doesn't require abandoning religious commitment or reducing spiritual traditions to mere psychology. It invites us to understand our individual faith journeys within the context of humanity's broader spiritual evolution. It suggests that the insights we discover in our own traditions participate in a larger conversation about consciousness and reality that has been going on for thousands of years and will continue for thousands more. The story of dying and rising gods is ultimately a story about hope. It expresses humanity's deepest conviction that consciousness transcends physical limitations, that love is stronger than death, and that meaning persists even in the face of apparent meaninglessness. These insights have appeared again and again throughout history because they reflect something essential about what it means to be consciously alive in an apparently unconscious universe. Understanding the true origins of resurrection mythology reveals these insights in their full historical depth and cross-cultural breadth. It shows us that we are part of a spiritual tradition that extends far beyond any single religion or culture. It connects us to countless generations of human beings who have faced the same fundamental questions about existence that we continue to grapple with today. This connection across time and culture is itself a form of resurrection, a way that consciousness transcends the limitations of individual mortality through participation in collective human understanding. The dying and rising God tradition lives on not just in religious institutions, but in the ongoing human search for meaning, transcendence, and hope in the face of uncertainty and loss. The evidence I've presented challenges us to think more deeply about what makes religious traditions valuable and meaningful. It suggests that significance lies not in historical uniqueness, but in continued relevance to universal human concerns. It points toward possibilities for spiritual understanding that honor both individual religious commitments and our collective participation in the broader human search for wisdom and transcendence. These possibilities will only expand as our knowledge of human religious history continues to grow, and our understanding of consciousness itself becomes more sophisticated. The conversation between ancient wisdom and contemporary insight will continue to generate new perspectives on the deepest questions of human existence. But that conversation requires honesty about where our religious traditions actually came from, how they developed, and what they share with other attempts to understand the mystery of conscious existence. The evidence about dying and rising gods is part of that honest conversation, a piece of the larger puzzle of human spiritual development that we ignore at our own impoverishment. The truth about resurrection mythology doesn't destroy religious faith. It reveals faith's deepest sources in the universal human experience of being consciously alive in a world that seems designed to extinguish consciousness at every turn. It shows us that our individual struggles with meaning and mortality connect us to a tradition of spiritual seeking that extends back to the very beginning of human civilization. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound realization of all, that the power of these ancient narratives lies not in their literal historical accuracy, but in their psychological and spiritual truth. When we examine the dying and rising God pattern across cultures, we're not just looking at random religious coincidences. We're observing the consistent emergence of archetypal patterns that address the deepest concerns of human consciousness. These patterns work because they mirror something fundamental about the structure of existence itself. Every day we experience small deaths and resurrections. We fall asleep and wake up. We exhale and inhale. We face setbacks and recover. The natural world around us demonstrates the same pattern. Seeds must die to become plants. Winter must come before spring. Darkness precedes dawn. The dying and rising God mythology simply takes these observable patterns and gives them cosmic significance. This is why these stories have such profound psychological impact. They're not just telling us about gods who lived long ago. They're describing the fundamental rhythm of existence that we participate in every moment of our lives. When ancient peoples created rituals around dying and rising gods, they were creating technologies for aligning human consciousness with the deepest patterns of reality itself. The mystery religions understood this intuitively. Their initiations weren't just symbolic ceremonies. They were practical methods for experiencing the death and rebirth cycle at the level of consciousness itself. Participants would undergo carefully orchestrated experiences that allowed them to literally die to their old identity and be reborn into a new way of being. Modern psychology has begun to understand what these ancient practitioners knew instinctively, that consciousness is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process that constantly dies and is reborn. Every moment of awareness involves the death of the previous moment and the birth of something new. Every significant life transition requires letting go of who we were to become who we're meant to be. The dying and rising god mythology provides a framework for understanding and navigating these transitions. It gives meaning to experiences of loss, suffering, and transformation that might otherwise seem random or meaningless. It suggests that what appears to be ending might actually be beginning, that what seems like death might be the prelude to new life. This is why Christianity was so successful in the ancient world. It took these profound psychological and spiritual insights and made them accessible to ordinary people through a simple story about a historical figure. You didn't need to undergo expensive mystery initiations or spend years studying esoteric philosophy. You just needed to identify with Jesus' death and resurrection through the simple act of baptism. But the power of the Christian story doesn't come from its historical uniqueness. It comes from its participation in this ancient tradition of transformation mythology. The story works because it expresses in concrete terms the abstract principles that humans have always intuited about the nature of consciousness and change. When Paul writes about dying with Christ and rising to new life, he's not just describing a theological doctrine. He's pointing toward a psychological reality that every human being can experience. When the gospel writers describe Jesus emerging from the tomb, they're not just recounting a historical event. They're using narrative to convey truths about consciousness that transcend the limitations of ordinary language. This understanding doesn't reduce Christianity to mere psychology or mythology. It reveals the psychological and spiritual foundations that give religious narratives their enduring power. It shows us why certain stories continue to resonate across cultures and centuries, while others fade into obscurity. The stories that survive are the ones that successfully map onto fundamental structures of human experience. They provide frameworks for understanding aspects of existence that remain consistent regardless of cultural context or historical period. They offer tools for navigating challenges that every conscious being must face. The dying and rising God pattern has survived for thousands of years because it addresses one of the most fundamental challenges of conscious existence: how to find meaning and hope in the face of loss, suffering, and apparent endings. Every human being faces moments when their world seems to collapse, when everything they've built appears to crumble, when death seems to have the final word. In Dying and Rising, God mythology offers a different these moments, the perspective. It suggests that what looks like ending might be transformation, that apparent death might be the prelude to unexpected new life. It provides hope not through denial of difficulty, but through reframing of meaning. So what does all this mean for you? The evidence is clear. The resurrection wasn't invented in first century Palestine. It was already ancient when Christianity emerged, woven into the fabric of human spirituality for millennia. This doesn't destroy faith. It reveals its true foundations in our deepest hopes and fears about mortality itself. Subscribe for more hidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew.